to understand the basic concepts of sustainable development so as we could try to integrate it in the engineering principles you have learned in this course. Now, one of the engineering principles that you have learned is about thermodynamics, particularly the second law of thermodynamics. Here, it talks about entropy. And entropy, in terms of environmental studies, would also be the ultimate measure of environmental degradation. So what does the equation really mean to us as environmental engineers? This simply means that whatever waste you have from the system could always be generated and will be thrown back to the universe or to the environment for that matter. So that means there is no such thing as zero waste. However, industry set this goal and objective so as to ensure that if they're not able to completely eliminate waste, they would at least minimize the impacts of this waste. Additional concepts of sustainable development is shown in this slide. So one is principles of stewardship. So we are supposed to take care of these resources. And then second, the responsibility should be shared. Why? Because if you would take, for example, atmosphere, if there is a certain contamination in the atmosphere, let's say it happened in a particular area, such as Japan, we had the nuclear meltdown there, right? Now, we here in the Philippines were afraid that the radiation would come to us. So that shows us that whatever happens in a particular region may affect not only that region, but also the neighboring ones and even further. Because the atmosphere doesn't have border. We only have the invisible borders for atmosphere. So that tells us that we need to have shared responsibilities. And then prevention and resilience. Although Mother Earth, as I've mentioned about the example on global warming or in stratospheric ozone depletion, even if the Mother Nature has a resilience, we still have to prevent because we are really bringing so much pressure on the environment. And then we have conservation, energy, and resource management. We also have rehabilitation and reclamation of damaged environment. Now, if you conduct environmental impact assessment, which is actually needed if you want to get a certificate in order for your establishment to be built, you have to include one portion which we call abandonment plan. You have learned from your design class that a particular industry would not be there for a lifetime. What's the minimum number of years for an industrial plant? It's 25 years. So it is imperative that if you build or prior to the building of that particular plant, you have to have a plan on how to abandon it so as to avoid some episodes that we had discussed in the introduction. Then you also have scientific and technological innovations. We have established that development is needed. You, especially you as the young generations, you are born with comforts. So you live in a life of comforts. So nobody here would say that you would want to have the condition of the Stone Age because you would be paying for comforts, right? So we don't prevent development, but rather we promote development. However, we have to make sure that we have sustainable development. And then of course, which is this one, international responsibility and global development would be related to our discussion on shared responsibilities. Now, for the particular conservation and of energy and resource as well as its management, we also discuss one concept of sustainability, which is working only on the limits of the environment. And this is actually technically defined as carrying capacity. Now, carrying capacity refers to the upper limit to population or community size imposed through environmental resistance. This figure shows you the connection of environmental resistance to carrying capacity. So some of the resistances due over time would include disease, predators, and limited space. Now, as engineers, you have to work only within carrying capacity. For example, we've mentioned before that in the identifying the site, you have to determine the site as well as the alternative source of raw materials. You don't depend 100% to the site as your resource of material because, for example, that particular resource would have 100 tons of capacity. And then your plant would be needing 100 tons also of products. Would you be utilizing the entire 100 tons capacity of your resource? Definitely not. A good sustainable engineer would at least give a margin of error for the carrying capacity. Probably about 15 to 20%, just to give the resource time to replenish. Sustainable development, as we keep on defining, is actually bound to three important dimensions. So, namely, you have the economic dimension, environmental, which is also known as ecological dimension, and then you have social dimension. Although nowadays, the social dimension is actually divided into political and cultural dimensions. How do we ensure sustainability with respect to economic dimensions? So an economically sustainable system must be able to produce goods and services on a continuing basis. Let's put an emphasis on continuing basis. And then it should maintain manageable levels of government and external debt. There's no such thing as an industry, no matter how rich the owner is, without a debt. There's no problem if you have a debt. The thing is, it has to be manageable to ensure sustainability. And then you also have to avoid extreme sectoral imbalances that damage agricultural or industrial production. Where do we basically get our resources? Basically, we get them from agricultural areas, right? So we would like to maintain a balance between industrial plant. We would be very happy if there is another industrial plant that would be coming up because that would mean future work, future job opportunities. But definitely, if we would be converting all agricultural areas into industrial areas, we will be limited to our production. So that would not be sustainable. Now, how about environmental dimension? How do we say that the system is an environmentally sustainable system? Number one, it should maintain a stable resource base. For that matter, we again reiterate the need to work within carrying capacity. And then we need to avoid overexploitation of renewable resource base. So sustainable development works or promotes renewable resources, the utilization of renewable resources. However, the next consideration says we should not deplete non-renewable resources beyond carrying capacity. So, depleting non-renewable resources only to the extent that investment is made in adequate substitute. So, we again highlight the need of alternative resource sinks. For this, you have to maintain biodiversity, atmospheric stability, and other ecosystem functions. And lastly, with respect to social dimension, we say that it is sustainable system if it achieves fairness in distribution and opportunity. It is also providing adequate provision of social services, including health and education, gender equity. I would like to highlight this portion where it relates to continuous service or continuous provision of the product. If you do not provide social services such as health and education, for example, a particular plant, you go to a particular plant and there is a problem on particulate matters. All of the staff would be required to wear a mask for more than 8 hours. Do you think it is sustainable? If the engineer gets sick, could you say, as the owner or as the manager, that you could replace that particular engineer? Well, there are so many unemployed, but how would it affect sustainability? We all know that prior to being hired as an engineer, you need to undergo what? Training. So when you do training, it involves cost. It also involves time. So in an industrial plant, these costs as well as the time would mean something and could affect the sustainability. So that is what we mean with having a socially sustainable system. How about the last part, the political accountability and participation? I probably assume that you have heard about several industries which are closed due to non-compliance to environmental regulations. Or if not, they would be sued or they would be penalized. Now, do you have an idea what would be the penalty for a particular water quality that you fail to conform? For each quality, you need to pay 5,000 pesos per day. And later, you would learn that there are 35 water quality parameters that you have to consider. So that would mean cost. And that cost would also affect economic sustainability. So that's the reason why we need to have political accountability and participation. Besides the fact that having a good image for a particular company would mean sustainable system.